Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers, participants, colleagues, and friends, thank you so much for joining the first webinar of the Cisco Heritage Center webinar series. Cisco is launching a webinar series trying to discuss issues and challenges that cultural heritage face nowadays, not only in the Cisco region, but of course all over the world. And we're trying to create a digital hub where heritage professional, experts, international organizations can communicate and transfer knowledge. Our first webinar is entitled Managing Disaster Risk to Cultural Heritage. We're trying to give insights on disaster risk management process, including preparedness, response, and recovery. Let me first, with great honor, of course, welcome our distinguished speakers, the Director of World Health Center, Dr. Lazar Asomo. Thank you so much for being with us. And I would also welcome Dr. Weber Ndoro, the Director of Heritage Center in the Islamic World. I would also welcome my colleagues from Heritage Center. They are with us in the same room. And our distinguished presenters today, we have Dr. Pascal Tarovenga, Dr. Christina Menegazi, Dr. Muhammad Bousaleh, and also Dr. Rohit Jigaso. He will join us later. And I would also welcome all participants, attendees from ICESCO member states and all over the world. We are delighted to have you with us. I would remind you this webinar is translated. So if you don't understand English and you want to hear Arabic language, so you can use this option from interpretation bottom in the screen. We have live translation. Let me now start with the opening remarks, and let's go to Director of World Heritage Center, Dr. Lazar. So thank you so much once again for being with us. And I know you are very busy today, but we would be very honored if you could open the webinar session by your remarks and guidance. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone, and good afternoon to maybe some of you who are connecting from a different time zone. The Director General of ICESCO, the Director of the Heritage Center of ICESCO, and the representative of ICESCO to UNESCO, and the dear colleagues, dear experts, and dear friends. I'm always very pleased to join you during this important moment. I think it shows that our cooperation is excellent between ICESCO and the World Heritage Center in the domain of the implementation of the World Heritage Convention. So this first series of webinars, which is organized by ICESCO and focusing on disaster risk management for cultural heritage and processes in preparedness, response, and the recovery, is a topic that is really welcome. And it's a topic that is becoming more and more critical in addressing the ever-increasing global challenges that heritage sites, be they culture or natural, continue to encounter, including World Heritage sites in particular. So as many of you are aware, our cultural and natural heritage sites continues to face risk in the face of some of the global challenges, some of the emergency challenges, and that makes them face some emergency situations, and we cannot remain just watching and not being active through our cooperation, through our constant reflections that we need to do. And that is important, particularly in the context of all the natural disasters that we are seeing, the effect of climate change, the armed conflicts, and I can list at least, even sometimes the human-made hazards And this is also important. And to address such risks, and I will say related emergency context, we at UNESCO and the World Heritage Center in particular continue to develop, and work through our international normative framework that will help to protect the world heritage and even cultural heritage. And I think this normative instruments in this normative framework, as we can say today, have been seen and as very robust. And that's the reason why the World Heritage Center, even after 52 years, continues to be so credible. And that's why the state parties continue to rely on the UNESCO Sixth Culture Convention because they have contributed to establishing standards, rules, and processes, which also tackles emergency situations, whether in relation to movable heritage, underwater heritage, intangible heritage, cultural and creative industries, and also museums and cultural institutions. So state parties to the World Heritage Conventions have developed for the issues related to climate change, as you know, a policy document on climate action for World Heritage, which provides high-level guidance on enhancing the protection and conservation on heritage of outstanding universal value through comprehensive adoption of climate actions measures. But also the fact that with our experience and the network of experts that we've started training and capacitating, we have now the experience to act, to intervene, but that is not enough. That's the reason why this cooperation is crucial with ICESCO, and to continue increasing the number of experts in the regions that will contribute to address some of the challenges that I've just mentioned, that are very important in working on disaster risk management processes, preparedness, and responses. 10 days ago, some of us were in Barcelona for the UNESCO's World Conference on Cultural Policies and Sustainable Development, which we call Mondiacult. And this conference concluded with ministers of culture committing to strengthening cultural policies in their countries and strengthening their institutions. And one of the priorities highlighted in the outcome document of this conference, this World Conference, focuses on integrating provisions related to culture and cultural heritage in disaster preparedness, crisis management, as well as post-crisis reconstruction and the recovery process. Moreover,
I think we have a problem. I will solve it now. Proceed.
You proceed. That is further.
Yeah. Please.
Lazare,
UNESCO has been supporting member states in strengthening emergency preparedness for culture by developing also policy guidelines, providing technical assistance, or supporting already initial capacity building. As you all know, through the Heritage Emergency Funds, which we call the HEF Fund, we provided support to many countries to enable strengthening disaster risk reduction and emergency preparedness for culture, including through the provision of capacity development, and including particularly in countries that are also members of ICESCO. So with this, we have been able to demonstrate a strong capacity to bring together various international experts to support vulnerable and conflict-affected countries, as well as recovery and reconstruction through human-centered approach. As an example, I will recall the launch of the flagship initiative, the Revive the Spirit of Mosul, which was launched in February 2018. UNESCO has mobilized 15 international partners and has successfully carried out the rehabilitation and recovery of the old city of Mosul, which is also in Iraq's tentative list. And this has been possible in collaboration with the government of Iraq and the local communities. Reconstruction projects included rebuilding historic landmarks, in addition to 124 heritage houses, which has contributed to the revitalization of the city and encouraging families to return home. And the rehabilitation and recovery work has generated more than 7,000 local jobs and numerous capacity building activities. This case represents a model of what can be done in other parts of the world through cooperation, where there may be similar challenges. And this is why our cooperation with ICESCO, it's absolutely crucial and important. And we also know that many countries are already engaging in the cooperation in training their experts, could be in the different countries. And we would like to continue supporting through our cooperation this work. And the UNESCO's approach, which draws on its Sixth Culture Convention, it's very important and will continue to respond to the needs and aspirations of local population who are at the heart of any response and recovery that we can do. And here, building capacities of all experts to support our cooperation, to support our all initiatives that we could do now and in future will be very important. So again, I would like really to thank ICESCO for launching this series of webinars to discuss all insights on disaster risk management process of preparedness, response, and the recovery. And I wish you fruitful discussions, and I look forward to continuing our cooperation in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lazar, for inspiring remarks and the valuable guidance. You mentioned networking, cooperation, and we need to expand our expert network in risk management and in heritage fields in general. You also mentioned UNESCO efforts in preparing toolkits, and the publication of disaster risk management of 2010 of the World Trade Center is unique and set principles of disaster risk management. We have also a speaker here. He's going to speak about climate change policy has been developed by UNESCO as well. And the case of Mosul, we're going to also have it in other webinars because it's unique. And it's I want to say that disaster risk management is not anymore an academic topic just to have publication on it. It's a must and need to be integrated in conservation and management plans. So thank you so much once again, and I hope you can stay longer than this with us. I will move to Dr. Weber Ndoro to give his opening remarks. So, Dr. Ndoro, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you for introducing me. Let me again start by thanking Lazar Elundu, who is a friend of mine for many years. I think it's more than 20 years ever since we started working together for Africa 2009. But let me welcome all the participants to this webinar organized by ICESCO. And we also welcome the member states who would also join. As rightfully pointed out by Lazar, ICESCO member states are also members of UNESCO. But what I have always said to people is that if you want to go very fast, go alone. But if you want to go far and have an impact, you work with others. And our philosophy here is to work with others, particularly UNESCO, ICROM, IUCN, and ICOMOS. We want to work together, even with other organizations which are in the region. And that's the only way we can all participate, all achieve the results which we want. And every organization which participates has a win-win situation. This webinar series is important for us because we want to initiate webinars which are going to tackle or discuss major topics affecting our heritage. Of course, because we have to answer to our member states, we have to particularly pay attention to ICESCO members. But ICESCO is not in isolation. It works with others. We are in Africa, we are in Asia, we are in the Arab region, and therefore we are supposed to work in all these regions. And I know UNESCO works all over the world. I am also delighted that when we started trying to organize for this webinar, there were so many professionals who said, we need this sort of thing, particularly a webinar which can join together the various components of various organizations, because we all know that each organization wants to do its own and they want to do their own webinar and all that. But we feel that perhaps if we jointly work together, then we're not bound to duplicate. We are bound to learn from each other, and that way we can go forward. Lazar has already pointed out some of the risks related to heritage. Let me point out, Lazar, that when I was at ICROM, we were also involved with MOSEL, in the work of MOSEL. And I also have a colleague here, Absi, who actually worked on the project in MOSEL. So we have been working, and we need to work together with other areas. The risks or the disasters are going to increase. And for us, we come from regions where conflict seems to be something going on, the Arab region, North Africa, and all that. And we need to make sure that the heritage professionals are ready to mitigate whatever disasters, whatever issues which arise. Hopefully, we can also work to the post-recovery period. It's important that we can begin to make sure that those things which have been destroyed in conflict, we can recover them. Heritage, as you know, is about identity. It is about us. So if your heritage is destroyed, you are no longer there. People at times say, but heritage is not important. Look at the soldiers. Look at what is happening in Gaza. What is the main target? The heritage is the target, because that destroys the identity of people. And this particular seminar is going to be trying to look at how can we minimize or mitigate against these disasters. It is part and parcel of our ICESCO approach. We want to be able to address issues related to heritage. One of our disappointing facts is that the highest number of sites in danger list are from our country, our members of ICESCO. And therefore, this means that we have to make sure that we build the capacity to ensure that they can be ready for any event, and we can also help them in many ways. Again, let me thank the director of the World Heritage Center at UNESCO for being with us. I can safely say that each time we say that we are going to invite Lazar to a workshop or conference or what, my DG is very excited that at least we are working together, and we shall continue working with UNESCO all the time, particularly the Heritage Center here at ICESCO. This is part and parcel of our work. We need to make sure that heritage is looked after. Let me also thank all those people who are going to be making their presentations. It's important that we work together. I'm happy that ICROM, I see Rohit has joined. That's very important for us because it's one of the partners we want to work with. It's important that we do work together. This is the first webinar after many years of not doing webinars at the Heritage Center here at ICESCO. And we hope that at least within a year or so, we should have every month or every 2 months, at least a webinar which addresses some of these issues of heritage. Let me then thank you all, and I do appreciate all the speakers, and we hope that we can begin to work together in a much more fruitful way. I'm not saying we're not working together now, but I think we can do more together. We can achieve more things than just one organization trying to answer all the issues of the world. I thank you. Shukran.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ndoro, for also inspiring remarks. And I can just quickly go through what you have said, that heritage is not only physical fabric, it's connected with identity as well. And these intangible aspects be considered in risk management as well. You have mentioned capacity building, cooperation. Cooperation is the key for risk management, of course. Thank you so much once again. And if you allow me, I will start the technical session, and we will go to our presenters. Let me first introduce to you Dr. Pascal. I would ask our presenters to keep the presentation up to 25 minutes maximum, considering the time. I understand that we can say a lot about risk management, but let's try to get the summary of your experience through your presentations. Dr. Pascal is archaeologist and heritage management expert, holding a PhD in archaeology and also a master's degree in heritage management. Currently, he is the head of department and senior lecturer in heritage studies at Rhodes University, South Africa. He has held many positions as well: Chief Heritage Officer, World Heritage Specialist, Program Manager, and also Director of Research and Development in many organizations, international organizations, and of course, national ones. He has also published more than 40 publications, articles, books related to many topics: archaeology, heritage management, conservation, and also world heritage and development in Africa. Dr. Pascal, we are looking for your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, and all protocols observed. But just allow me to recognize Dr. Webandoro, who has been my mentor, my supervisor, and the really person that molded me into heritage management, and also recognize Lazar, our director at the center, for the work that is doing on the global scene to promote world heritage. And thank you so much to ICESCO for inviting me. And I would like to focus my presentation on a title which is Shock Response, Resilience and Adaptation, Connecting Theory and Practice in Disaster Risk Mitigation at World Heritage Sites. So what I'll try to do in the next 20 minutes is share my experience with disaster risk planning, because when I was growing up in my village, the veiled fires that would threaten our crops and our homesteads, I didn't know that it was a disaster. I used to think that it's just an occurrence. But when I got a little bit of educated and exposed, I realized that all along I've been dealing with disasters in our villages, and the mechanisms that we're using there were built on experiences, resilience, and adaptation, which is the very same thing that we do with disaster risk. And when I joined National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, as a curator, during orientation week, I went to Great Zimbabwe, and that week there was a devastating fire, and I was part of the team that was fighting the fire. And what I recall was that I lost my wristwatch in the process, and that demonstrates that sometimes if you are not prepared well how to handle a disaster, you might also end up harming yourself or even losing life. So those are the things that we need to learn about. And when I was at Robben Island, we were the first World Heritage Site in South Africa to develop a disaster risk management plan, and we were supported by the African World Heritage Fund, and we produced a disaster risk that took into consideration the remote location of Robben Island in the event of a disaster. You are marooned on the island, and the mainland is about 11.5 kilometers. How do you respond to disaster? So we had to look at all those things. And also we had to look at the archives that relate to Robben Island that are situated in a university called University of Western Cape, and say, how do you prepare for student demonstrations that end up burning buildings and infrastructure, and we have a priceless collection there. So we had to really look at the context of each element of this property. And currently, even at Rhodes, we are looking at special collections in Corey Library and at Elam, which is a music archive that has collections from all over Africa to say what kind of a disaster risk plan should we put in place to safeguard these aspects. So with this experience, I want to talk about the concept of disaster risk briefly, and then I'll connect it with the practice in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm going to use a case study from my own country, Zimbabwe, and also other case studies from other countries in the region. To me, disaster is very simple. We all know what disaster is all about. We use different definitions, but in the heritage context, disaster can be defined as an event or a process, whether it's natural or human-induced, that causes damage, destruction, or irreversible alteration to cultural heritage, thereby threatening its significance or what we consider as outstanding universal value in terms of world heritage, authenticity, integrity, and the continuity of a particular site. So disasters, they do happen. We know it's, so how prepared are we? And when you look at World Heritage Sites across the world, I think majority of World Heritage Sites are not yet destroyed, but many are already vulnerable due to exposure to hazards. For example, in the latest statistics provided by UNESCO, 21% of World Heritage Sites are facing overlapping natural and human-induced hazards that the director from the center highlighted in his speech. So these risks can be natural. It can be fire, floods, earthquakes, climate change. It can be wild coral bleaching. It can be glacial loss, or it can be technological, especially with collections, where you have IT failures and you lose the database and everything else, and there's no backup. So digitization also comes with its own risks. And for example, in Africa, the issue of power provision, electricity, where we have in many countries, you don't have electricity the whole day. It has got a potential for disaster risk. And then, of course, there's the human-caused risks. For example, issues of conflict, vandalism, theft, and so on and so on. And when you look at disaster risk exposure of World Heritage sites across the world, you realize that there's a study which was done by UNESCO and WRI, and it's a 2025 report which says about 73%, which means about 1,172 World Heritage sites, they are exposed to a risk, and that's an issue of concern to us, not just as African continent, but at a global level. It means we have to be responsive. And when you look at those 1,172 sites, you look at the exposure rates from a perspective of vulnerability, you realize that the majority, they are at a risk from water stress risk, and also severe drought risk due to the impact of climate change. And I'm not going to say a lot around the impact of climate change because my colleague from ICROM is going to talk about the whole issue around disaster risk and the impact of climate change. So the shock that comes with disasters is like the Notre Dame, where we just woke up in the morning and we saw pictures, videos being screened across the world that it's going through a serious crisis, the site, and that restoration has happened, but at a cost. And this is something that comes with disaster recovery. You have to budget for it. And when you look at the threats that usually end up becoming the risk, you have to understand the source of those threats. You have to understand their impact on the OUV, authenticity, integrity, attributes, and the protection and management system of a property. And you also have to understand whether they're going to have a direct impact on the site or an indirect impact. So most often in most sites, people tend to deal with the effects rather than the root cause of these threats. So disaster risk allows us to do a case analysis approach where we actually go to the root of the problem so that we are not mitigating the effects. We have to mitigate the root, and sometimes it's very difficult to arrive that without doing proper research. And of course, there's terminology that comes with disaster risk, and I will not dwell on that because there's a lot of publications and guidelines produced by UNESCO, ICROM, and other partners that you can access. So they define disaster, emergence, hazard, and what mitigation means, which is the most important part in this process, which is to alleviate or reduce the impact of the disaster on a site. And some of them it's about loss and damage. How does that disaster affect lives at that site and the property, the infrastructure, and the attributes of the World Heritage property? So for us to have an understanding of what disaster risk is all about, first of all, you have to understand the hazard, which could be an earthquake, and then you have to analyze the vulnerability of the property from that hazard, which could possibly result in weak structures because of vibrations. And then you look at the exposure. What is the exposure of that hazard to the heritage site, to the communities at the heritage site, and the collections? And the analysis of the hazard, vulnerability, and exposure is what defines the disaster that we are dealing with at a particular site. And disaster in that case is the damage that is induced by the risk, or the loss resulting from the risk, or the disruption of systems caused by the risk that we identified. So therefore, it means we need to actually have a risk mitigation mindset all the time and say, how do we address all these things that are happening? And I know in the triage of disaster risk response across the world, the first priority is saving lives and the restoration of public infrastructure, and the heritage then becomes secondary. So it is our responsibility, I think, going forward to make sure that heritage is prioritized in the first layers of the triage that is used by state parties when they are responding to disaster risk. And when we talk about disaster risk mitigation, we are talking about the response, and it's a logical process where you start by risk identification and assessment, and then you go to mitigation strategies, and you then go to preparedness and contingents, like the example that I gave you of me losing a wristwatch during a firefighting at Great Zimbabwe. It means I was not dressed properly. I was not trained properly to say, how do you respond to something like this? What do you wear and everything else? And then the fourth stage is the recovery and the rehabilitation, where we're actually doing the mitigation work, and we're saying, this is how we're going to recover the loss and the damage that has happened at the site. And of course, the last thing that is important is monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We become innovative from learning and experiencing and innovating. So in the process of designing the response, I think what is important, in my opinion, is to consider whatever mitigation measure you're going to do, what is its impact on the OUV, the integrity, the authenticity of the property, and how does the legal context pan out at national level in relation to international protocols, and how do you bring the role playing into a synergy where it becomes an inclusive process and a stakeholder driven process, which I learned at Robben Island. And communication is key in the process of designing this response. And I'd like to give an example of Great Zimbabwe World Heritage Site, which is in Southern Africa, and it's just about 320 or 340 kilometers from Harare, the capital city of Zimbabwe. And they have a disaster risk frame which was produced early this year, and I was privileged to be part of the team that was working with this project, as I was working with UNESCO ROSA in Harare, coordinating the Great Zimbabwe Development Project. So now Great Zimbabwe, for the very first time, it has a disaster risk plan for the Great Zimbabwe National Monument World Heritage Site. And that disaster risk management plan aims to mitigate the risks impacting the site and also bring together stakeholders who may not have, without this document, been able to work together because they were working in silos. And one of the things that is very important with disaster risk is having a logical process you follow and a logical document that anyone can be able to interpret and read very easily, as the Great Zimbabwe, which has got the objectives, the risk identification assessment, prevention and mitigation, and then the emergency preparedness plan and the recovery plan, as well as the implementation framework and the overarching thing, which is monitoring and review. So for example, at Great Zimbabwe, in the context of identifying and analyzing a risk, I'll just use one. They identified the fire hazard, and it's coming from uncontrolled bushfires during dry season that could spread to the monument, threatening the stone structures. And the impact level can be low, can be medium, can be high. And in this case, it is medium. And the affected areas are identified as the vegetation zone and the buffer zone and the monument itself. So it includes the property and the boundary and the areas around the site. And the mitigation strategies that they identified is maintaining of fire breaks, community fire awareness programs, monitoring of fire-prone areas. And the stakeholders that will do that is the National Museums, which is the management authority, local fire authorities from the Masvingo province, and the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority, was the management park just across. So in terms of risk assessment matrix, you realize that that fire, I will use the same example. The fire, the likelihood of that fire happening is very low, but the impact is very high because it can burn anything else. The reason why it's low is because the Great Zimbabwe already have fire guards, they have firefighting equipment, and they have trained their staff. So if in the event that is going to happen, and the impact is going to be high, even though the likelihood is low. So disaster risk planning is a critical process where you critically look at the existing strategies and how they are functioning and how they are going to help you or how you are going to build from there. So there is need to maintain the existing fire breaks and the existing fire management framework at Great Zimbabwe, but also there's additional mitigation that is required. For example, enhance the fire prevention training that encompasses all these different groups. And when you look at prioritization for matrix again, using that fire, you realize that the likelihood overall is medium, but the impact is very high because once a fire burns something, it's gone. And the risk level, therefore, is high, and it means it's a priority for Great Zimbabwe. And they have to monitor the vegetation, and they have to monitor the fire breaks and everything else. And then, of course, mitigating the risk, the fire risk, what the management plan does for Great Zimbabwe, the disaster risk mitigation plan, and I'll just use this one as an example, you realize that there is mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, and prevention. So for every aspect, for example, mitigation, they start by identifying what already exists and what can be maintained. And then the next set of color, which is like orange, is ongoing activities. And then the red color is future activities. So disaster risk mitigation is not a once-off exercise and is not an overnight process. It's a process where you sustain good practices or you maintain good practices that have been in place, and you enhance the current practices, and you also become innovative. So for example, with firefighting equipment, Great Zimbabwe, they really want to innovate and use technology for monitoring. And I know that for now, they have actually acquired some equipment, including drones, that can be used to monitor the area around Great Zimbabwe. But of course, you need a license to operate that drone. So they've done that for every risk that has been identified. And this one is about the structural risks of Great Zimbabwe, because it's a dry stone walling site where the walls don't have any mortar in between. So it's just granite blocks, one block laid after the another. So they've done a thorough analysis and say, how do we do recovery at the site? And they're recommending long-term restoration plans, replacement of damaged materials, and strengthening structural integrity. So they've done the same thing with the risk of climate, which was identified, and highlight all these things. And then when you look at disaster risk, which I think is it's an integrated strategic approach, because most of the time, sometimes it's an isolated plan, which is not linked to any other plan at the site. For example, at Great Zimbabwe, this disaster risk mitigation plan is now linked to the new management plan, which was produced in 2024. And there's also a new tourism development plan, which was also produced in 2024. So there is a link between all these things to make sure that there is no duplication of resources and there's no loss of time in terms of mitigating the impacts or the threats at the site. So integrated disaster risk mitigation, it means we have to plan and budget for this. And this is just an example at Great Zimbabwe, where they look at climate adaptation and they've put a budget for what needs to be done in the next 5 years. And of course, also with the disaster risk mitigation, the issue is about coordination structures for implementing that disaster risk. Together we stand, and divided we fall. So Great Zimbabwe has actually designed a structure which brings top-level coordination all the way from cabinet to the Department of Civil Protection, and this has been reduced to the site level, where there are various role players that are going to work with Great Zimbabwe World Heritage Site. The same that we did at Robben Island, where we brought in even partners like the National Sea Rescue Institute in case there's a boat capsizing in between the island and the mainland, and they will be able to assist with rescuing passengers, including the vessel itself. And then, of course, the other issue that I want to raise is with disaster risk is the inclusivity. And here I'm using the example of Kasubi Tombs in Uganda, which was gutted by fire in 2010. And the restoration of this site could not be done without the communities. So therefore, traditional knowledge, community stewardship, and partnerships between local communities, national authorities, and international organizations are central to successful recovery strategies in case of disaster. And then the other area that is very hazy at the moment is the digital aspect of heritage. How do we use digital mechanisms and digital tools to assist with monitoring and evaluation our risks at the site? For example, at Great Zimbabwe now they have drones that they can use to monitor the site, and they have installed an electronic system that is monitoring the walls. So we need to get into that space. We shouldn't allow the fear of technology to stop us from investing into this process. And then, of course, a holistic approach for disaster risk, which I've learned over the years, is that we need to raise risk awareness among different stakeholders. We need to do proactive planning, and we need to facilitate collaboration between and among different stakeholders. And we also want to do what I call continuous learning. And as a parting shot, I would like to reiterate that while disasters may be unpredictable and they occur anytime, it is our past experience that can better equip us for tomorrow from a disaster risk preparedness perspective. And I always think that your moment of challenge is an opportunity for innovation. So I see disaster risk planning as an opportunity for us to innovate in terms of management and conservation at World Heritage Sites. And secondly, heritage needs to be prioritized on the triage of responding to disasters at national level. This can only start at national level before we even go to the international level. If there's a disaster, let's make sure that heritage is also prioritized. Thirdly, resilience and adaptation remain strategic human interventions in anything that we do. So we need to keep this capacity. We need to document our experiences on the African continent, and we need to share. Sometimes we think good practices come out of other continents. But I mean, I can confidently tell you that there are good practices around disaster risk mitigation on this African continent that we can learn from. So we need to continue sharing experiences and building capacity. And also, lastly, think about the unimaginable. Heritage sites at some point will remain in existence, but in different forms, because there are other disasters that we will not be able to deal with it. And in closing, my new definition of disaster risk planning is do remember me, please, during disasters. This is what all the World Heritage Sites are saying. This is what all heritage sites in our national boundaries are saying. They need to be remembered during disasters. Thank you so much. And thank you for giving me this time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pascal. And thank you for the nice introduction. You just provided us with the theoretical background of the disaster risk management, and you make the job easier for other presenters so they can directly go to the technical terms and details. I would also mention that disaster risk management plan is not only plans that just we sit and have a documents. Finally, you have a structural institutional structure, let's say, to how to deal with disasters. And also at the very beginning, you define risks and disaster that your heritage site is facing, and also you also set kind of measures that you know exactly how to deal with these risks at the very beginning stage of the shock. So thank you so much. I would hear from Dr. Lazar, Dr. Barandoro, if you have any comments, and other experts. So anyway, I can receive comments anytime during the the webinar. So please feel free to contribute. Let me move to our second presenter, Dr. Rohit Jigaso. Dr. Rohit is, of course, a public figure in the field of risk management and disaster risk management. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's very early now in New York. Dr. Rohit is a conservation architect, risk management professional from India. working at ICROM as a program manager on sustainable urban and built heritage conservation, disaster climate risk management, post-crisis recovery. He has undertaken post-disaster assessments in India, Nepal, Japan as well, and also worked on updated policy document on climate action for World Heritage, which adopted by UNESCO. He's also an author and co-author of many resource manuals, handbooks, and also many other publications in cultural heritage. Dr. Rohit, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Muhammad, and thank you to ICESCO for inviting me to speak here. And it was really nice to hear Pascal, because he laid a very good foundation, as you rightly said, Muhammad. So I'm going to speak about a bit beyond just disaster risk management and what we should do for heritage, because I think there's a lot which has been written and has been communicated. But over the last few years, I have been thinking how we should redefine or rethink about heritage conservation and management while our heritage is really focused, is really faced with the disasters and really the issue of climate change. So this is my presentation's topic. And we all know that extreme climate related disasters are increasing, and definitely heritage is at risk, as has been already pointed out, whether we talk about droughts, floods, extreme temperatures, storms, or all kinds of or sea level rise. We know that climate change and disasters related to climate change are on the rise. Just an example to say how complex the situation is. You are all aware of Los Angeles, where there was a big fire, um, actually earlier this year. And what was really evident in this, while the research was done, was that this was not just a result of dry spell or drought, but it was a result of changes in the seasons. So there was heavy rainfall, and which was not in the right month as it was supposed to be, and then it was proceeded by long spell of no rain. So what happened was that this heavy rain, which happened in very few days, with very high intensity, actually led to a huge growth in vegetation, and that vegetation became fuel when the long dry spell happened. So it was not just the question of dry spell, but it's a question of wet season followed by dry, long dry spell of weather, which created the kind of disaster that we saw, where a lot of natural as well as cultural heritage was at risk, or some of it was even damaged. So we need to understand the complexity, where floods, for example, in Valencia, the frequency of the floods has not been so high, but the intensity of flood was much higher, where the amount of water that was received in very little period of time exceeded the average rainfall that would have taken place in the whole year. So with the result that the infrastructure, our heritage institutions were not prepared to deal with this high intensity rainfall in a shorter time span. In Pakistan, there has been floods recently as well, and in 2022, when a lot of heritage was impacted not just by rain, but by having water really get stagnated for almost couple of weeks, with the reason, and as a result, these adobe structures could not survive. So we have to look at the infrastructure as well, which is not sometimes part of heritage site or its management, but has a huge impact on disaster risks. And vulnerable, fragile, historic materials are not really able to sustain this long water stagnation and the kind of temperature and humidity conditions that are created more and more severe due to climate change. Uh, Pascal talked about the heritage issues with regards to disasters, but rising sea levels is a threat, not only in Africa, but actually around the world. Here is just a very striking figure that 70% of African heritage sites by 2050 will be threatened by rising sea levels. So we have to also consider these slow and progressive or cumulative factors that are going to affect our heritage site and not just the catastrophic events. So when we talk about risks, we have to be aware of both the catastrophic and these slow and progressive factors. And rather than just looking at cultural elements, we are more and more recognizing that the entire ecology is being disturbed because of climate change. So you may have cultural landscapes not being able to sustain because a certain species cannot grow in the new environmental conditions, or a certain kind of architecture cannot be maintained. For example, in this World Heritage Site of Shirakawa-go in Japan, where you don't have enough thatch or the natural materials available to maintain these kind of houses that define this World Heritage property. So we have to be able to get to understand that there are many direct and indirect impacts of disasters and climate change, which are on the ecology, on the materials, as you see here, where biological decay or weathering, it has always been there. It's not like it is only a result of climate change, but the rate of change is much higher now. There's much more faster biological decay process or weathering process, and we have to be really aware that the rate of change is really also an issue that we have to grapple with. I'm right now on Nantucket, which is a historic island on the east coast of United States, and with ICROM and the local organization, we are in fact doing a course on climate action for built heritage. And this island is really a living lab for understanding the impacts of on natural and cultural heritage, because here the impacts are just too faster and are very evident. So here you can see the historic flood events, and you can see how the flood events have been really on a rise, and you have them even more and more frequent, and these are being recorded very carefully. And of course the whole historic settlement is at risk. These are those houses which are very well documented, are of historic value, and have a very good view, as you can see from this point of view, where the photograph is being taken. But as you go down, you see this is the reality. The weathering is really going on at a very high rate, and you can even see on the right side that the road has actually collapsed. So this is the kind of situation we are dealing with, where climate change is really increasing the rate of erosion to a very alarming degree. And of course what happens is that these historic properties are now facing a challenge. I mean, you cannot really stop that erosion, at least not in the next few years. But more and more, these houses, as you can see on the right side, are just on the edge and are disappearing or even falling down more often. So what is the opportunity? I mean, what is the option available for you? So you can see here some of those houses are being raised on ground. So you can see that these are being lifted up, as you can see on the image on the other two images. And this is, I would call forced adaptation, because this is being forced to be done because there is no other choice. So since the water levels are rising, since there are more coastal flooding, you have to go for this option. But the question is, how best can we keep the values? Because if we raise the height, the values are also, of course, going to be compromised. And in situations where there is no other scope left, where this house on the edge of the eroded area is going to be lost maybe any time in a year or even before, then how can we prepare for eventual loss of heritage? These are difficult questions, but these are the questions that we have to really take into consideration now while we talk about our approach for heritage conservation and management. And when we talk about what is likely to happen in the future, here you can see the image as it was in 2019, but then I just take you through how the projections are. In 2060, you can see there will be 4.54 6.14 feet of water, which will surround this historic area. And then in 2080, 6.14 feet of water will be there. And then in 2100, it will rise up to 8 feet. So this is the kind of future scenario that we are looking at, where you will see that a large part of historic urban area will be under water, and you have no way to really save that aspect. So we have to deal with it. And as we know that the projected changes are very alarming in terms of the surface temperatures and in terms of the precipitation. You can see this on the from 2081 to 2100, how much higher or how much increase in the surface temperature is expected. So this is the kind of situation we are in. We also know that with greenhouse gas emissions and the associated risks, the scenarios are pretty alarming. So the question is, and this is what I want to raise, we are now not aware of where our future is going to be. We cannot say it with great confidence. What is it that is likely to happen in the future? We can, of course, have a scenario, but not a real understanding of how the situation is going to unfold. So, where we will end up in the future, we are not sure. So it's becoming very unpredictable as we understand from how the projections are. Also, there is this question of black swan events. We see more and more unpredictable events that happen. COVID-19 was one example where we are facing these events without having any past history of those events. So we have to also understand that our heritage has to be prepared for this uncertain future and unpredictable future. So what does it mean? Our heritage conservation and management practice has to embrace this uncertainty. We have to feel comfortable with these uncertain situations and have to start preparing for this uncertain future. And we have to start preparing for the changing context, which is already happening and which is part of our heritage. For long, we have considered change as something that we should run away from because we want to preserve heritage. But the fact is that the context is changing, whether social, in terms of the communities, the economic context, the environmental, institutional, and even the people's attitudes and perceptions change. So the changing context has to be recognized while we deal with heritage conservation. And we have to know that no matter how much we want to keep the heritage values for prosperity, values will change and transformed, and new values will be created over time. And we have to recognize this reality. And heritage is not static, it has to be considered in a dynamic way as not just a built form, not just only a relation with people, but a link between the built form, the people, and the environment, where nature and culture interact with each other in a dynamic way. So, this kind of evolutionary idea of heritage, where all these elements connect with each other, is absolutely essential for us to really deal with the issues of disasters and climate change. And that's what is something that we have to be considering, how these impact values, because the impact on values because of disasters and climate change are quite different. Some of the values might get transformed, and we need to know how they will be transformed and at what rate these will get transformed, which values will be lost and to what extent, and which new values are created post disaster. So values are not static, values are dynamic. And in relation to disasters and climate change, we have to start understanding these changes are transformations or loss or even the new production of values over time. And we need to move when we have to deal with the uncertainty, unpredictability, as I mentioned earlier. We need to move from relying a lot more on deductions or past data to move to really looking into predictions, to looking into the models that tell us what the future scenarios are going to be and how can we prepare our heritage site to disasters. So in a nutshell, I would say we should embrace change, but the crucial question is what kind of change we want, where heritage values are not lost forever. It also means that we need to prepare for multiple potential scenarios and anticipating them in advance for better preparedness. So we need to work a lot more in heritage conservation and management practice with developing multiple scenarios and trying to develop actions, proactive actions to deal with those scenarios. And that also means that we need to find out what will be our desired absolutely something that we need to work on in this trajectory, whether we accept the change, prepare for eventual loss, or engage in an act of regeneration. So designing these pathways of change for our heritage is really an essential consideration that has to be given. It is no longer only mitigation. It is no longer only reducing the risk to our heritage we have to deal with. We have to also deal with how can our heritage adapt to this changing context, as was also mentioned earlier by Pascal. So this adaptation issue has to be really grappled with for heritage conservation practice. It also means that how do we want to see the future of the present of our past, not just caring for our past as something that is no longer alive, but as something that we need to take to the future. What is that acceptable change that ensures continuity of heritage through evolution is some important issue that we need to address in our conservation practice. While we talk about the heritage coming from the past, a difficult question, but a very important question that we have to start to think about is which heritage are we creating at present for the future generations? Because it's not only the act of the past that we need to preserve, but we need to be continuously doing this act of creation of heritage for the future, which requires creativity, innovation, and adaptability as an important element in heritage conservation and management practice.
For
Because
interrupting,
heritage
only 1
creation
minute.
is a
We have 2 minutes.
yes, is a continuous act. I'm closing soon. So heritage is not to be considered just a reference of the past, but also a reference for the future. And risk management of heritage provides an opportunity to build a sustainable and resilient future. So I would like to close by advocating a new approach that at ECROM we are also very much emphasizing, where we are not just looking at individual heritage components, but really going for a heritage place-based approach where we look at the interconnections between different elements, which means that rather than looking at heritage site, we move to a territorial way of heritage management where we consider the larger context, because it is the larger context within which values are produced. Sometimes even the outstanding universal values are very much relying on the larger set of values which exist beyond these boundaries. But at the same time, we need to interlink multiple levels, whether urban or fringe or the rural areas, and look at the interconnections between them. So I would like to conclude by advocating resilience as an important concept, which is not just about uh, bouncing back, but bouncing forward. That is, we reduce the vulnerability and we go for adaptation and transformation rather than mere preservation of heritage. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rohit, for your presentation. And let me connect both together, Pascal and Rohit. In the case of Pascal, when we do the disaster risk management, we know the risk we're dealing with. But when it comes to the climate change, it brings new risks, and also it increases the intensity, and also could be the exposure of some attributes to different type of risks. Also, you brought a good idea to the webinar that typical solutions and measures have been taken could be not efficient sometimes when we deal with the climate change. So it needs to be carefully predicted and studied. You also mentioned inclusive approach, like to consider economic, social aspects, a lot of things. But I have a question, Rohit, when it comes to the people who are dealing with heritage sites. So is there any kind of toolkit, documents, guidance of how to understand climate change impact on our heritage sites? could you guide us to specific resources that could be helpful for people?
Sure. Well, just to say that climate change toolkit for World Heritage is currently being prepared by the advisory bodies of the World Heritage, ICRAM especially, and IUCN under the World Heritage Leadership Program. So currently this draft is ready and we are in the process of testing for various sites to be able to refine this toolkit, and hopefully this will get published later this year, or not later this year, next year for sure. So this is definitely one of the important manual kind of or something that can guide how to deal with climate change. But of course, there are also other tools that are available. For example, there is a tool which is which is called vulnerability index for climate change, which has been developed and has been tested in several World Heritage sites. But I would say that a lot of research has been done, manuals are being produced, but what is really needed is some practical actions on the ground, because for site managers, climate change is still something very high up on the ground, up from the ground, and it is not really connected to their day-to-day work reality. So how can we influence their day-to-day practice so that climate change impact can be integrated in the way they do their management, in the way they do their maintenance, is something that we are trying to do. We are also currently on this island of Nantucket doing this training course since last year, and now we are actually going to produce a publication which is coming out of our experience on this island, which is really on the front line of dealing with climate change in relation to built heritage. So, I mean, all these different initiatives are there, which can be very helpful. Thank you.
Keep us updated with the results and any documents you have published, or maybe
Sure.
the international organization about this. We have also comments about climate change from Dr. Ndoro, please.
No, thanks for the two presentations so far. But there's a connection between the two of them. And I think one of the issues which we have to be trying to look at is when you look at a risk and disaster, what is the value which we are trying to protect of the site? Why am I saying that? I think Pascal gave us examples of two sites which have fires, one in Uganda and one in Zimbabwe. From us as experts, fires are a disaster. They are going to affect the site in some ways. But does the local community look at it that way? Because I know, for example, if there is no fires in the dry season, the community gets worried because they think it's not going to rain if the fires don't come up. So how do we reconcile our expert thinking with the local community? And again, the Pascal's example of Kasubitum in Uganda is a very good example in the sense that the community itself at some point felt that the grass could not protect their site. What did they do? They put iron sheets, right? But because now we want it to be on the World Heritage, we put thatch, right? But they had already seen the problem of fire a long time ago, that if you put thatch, we are going to be struggling with, with trying to prevent these fires. So I'm just saying that at times when we say this is a disaster to the community, it might be a disaster in other areas, but it may not necessarily affect the heritage itself.
So that's very interesting that we should kind of maybe provide better understanding from the local community themselves. That's why we call local community engagement at the very beginning stage of disaster risk management. So we can maybe better understand our nature and how, like, maybe they're dealing with material, how they understand disaster. Maybe we focus on a value, but for themselves, it's part of the daily life. So it's way complicated than we think, but in the same time, to include everyone and engage local community at the very stage could be a solution and bring better ideas and measures. Thank you, Doctor, for your comments. And if you allow me, I will proceed Dr. Rahid, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I will proceed with Dr. Christina Menegasi. Dr. Christina, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, you
Hi,
hear us. Thank
everybody.
you. So let me introduce you to the webinar participants. Dr. Christina is a heritage professional with working experience worldwide in Africa, Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific, and many other regions. She has been working for more than 30 years in the field of heritage, cultural heritage, including different area conservation, disaster risk management, and also she has been responsible for many international cultural heritage mega projects. She's not only professional with a professional experience, she holds a PhD in disaster risk management for cultural heritage. She also worked with many UNESCO offices all over the world. She has experience in post-disaster needs assessment, and she worked with the World Bank as well, Italian agency. Sorry, Christina, this is a very short bio of your short bio. You have done a lot of things, impressive experience, so we are proud to have you with us. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, and thank you, ICESCO, for inviting me. Thank you, Dr. Ondoro. I think it has been perfect, this order of speakers. Thank you to the previous speaker, Pascal and Rohit, because you have introduced exactly in a very good manner the theme of this webinar. I am basically a museum curator at the origin of my career, so I deal more with movable heritage. So it means collections of museums, collection in libraries, in archives, etc. And so the presentation of today, just to complement what has been already said by my previous colleagues, is really to show the peculiarities of movable heritage in the risk of disaster risk management. I just add before I start with the presentation that at the moment I live in Pakistan, and I was called actually to come here because of the flood of 2022 that Rohit mentioned. And unfortunately, and I added something about climate change, this summer 2025, there has been another flood very similar to the one which has happened in 2022. So 22 was considered like something very exceptional, but we see that the provisions are not actually happening as it was foreseen, but much quicker and much faster. So just to on this unfortunately not nice note, I start with the presentation where as I said, I try to give the peculiarities of movable heritage in disaster risk management. In a certain sense, we can say that there is an advantage because of their possibility to be moved, their collections, the objects, and the approach is more item-centered, item or collection-centered, much more than building or site. Risk assessment, prioritization, and response happen at the low object level or collection level. And of course, there are many catalogs, records, condition reports, rather than building component to be looked at. As the title of the webinar was Prevention, Response, and Recovery, I try to follow a little bit the same path, which are, of course, as you all know, the three main moments in the disaster risk management cycle. The prevention for movable heritage includes and focuses on evacuation plan, preparation of evacuation plan of the items, of the emergency plan for the different institutions. Of course, exhibition rooms and storage management is also to be taken into account. Environmental control, object handlings, pest management, security-related matters. So these are all things that can be tackled and used during the prevention in the case of movable heritage. So movable heritage are protected by their buildings, being a library, a museum, or archive, buildings that might be historical, buildings that might be new or constructed and built on ad hoc for preserving the collection. But even if there is this kind of layers of protection, they are also vulnerable as much as the built heritage, archaeological site, etc. So for this reason, we have to really identify the peculiarities and understand what is better to be put in place in order to mitigate the impact of a different kind of disasters. In the response phase, of course, you pass to action, and there are emergency actions, which include, of course, the evacuation of the items of museums or libraries or archives, the pack out of all the items, and the identification of safe space, safe rooms, where to locate the objects that have been evacuated. And then, of course, all the definition of a chain of custody, because those items has been transferred to another location, which normally should be identified before something happened, of course. Here you see, in the case of a response, of course, you have to do a kind of emergency inventory of the object that you are able to evacuate, because we will see later, not every object will be able to be evacuated in case of a disaster. And of course, it will depend a lot if we are speaking about a fire, which might be localized only in one area of the building, or a flood, or a earthquake, which is affecting the whole territory and not only the museum. So it will, of course, depend a lot of the kind of threat of disaster that is happening and the intensity. But of course, what is to be remembered is that prevention actions has to be put in place, and the team of the museum has to know which kind of action has to do at the moment when the disaster strikes. Of course, at the same time, networks of other stakeholders which might be included in the response has to be prepared in advance. And this is also part of what we can say prevention preparation. So in the case of the action during the response, we have, as I said, we have to intervene with emergency inventory. So normally we should have some kind of digital forms, if possible, or paper format. It depends where we are, the level of inventory that we have, etc. We have to have a basic understanding about how to pack the object in order to be sure that moving them, evacuating them, and storing them in another safe place will not become an additional threat to the existing one. And of course, there needs to be a methodology to do all those kind of actions, which normally it is described in the evacuation plan, in the emergency plan of the institution. During the recovery phase, of course, what is very important is the role of the inventories, of the catalogs, barcoding, or any kind of other digital system, because this will permit to understand the loss of the items that has disappeared during the disaster. This is really something that is playing a very important role. I remember when I was asked by UNESCO to go to in 2018 after the fire of the National Museum of Rio de Janeiro, where the totality of the collection was destroyed by this big fire. Actually, and the inventory was also destroyed, digital and paper format. The major problem was really the possibility to recompose, re-establish a new collection, more or less with the same kind of item. Of course, not the same item, but typology of item as before the disaster. So, as I said, inventory for the archives, also digital catalogs, list of locations. It is important. Items might be located in exhibition areas, might be located in storeroom, might have been loaned for exhibitions to other museums. So it is very important that there is a paper format or digital format, but some recording or where the objects were at the moment of the disaster, because this is useful to understand at the end and have a better understanding about the loss. Pictures, of course, it is not only useful for the issue of looting in the inventories, but it is also important in the issue of a disaster, because this can also provide information about the potential damages of the items in case it is not a situation of total damages. So you can do a comparison between the image of before the disaster and after a disaster. So this is absolutely fundamental and important when you think about how to develop, how to maintain, how to do your inventory. Because yes, if you don't know what you have, you don't measure the potential loss of value, potential loss of your items. And that's why it is really important to concentrate and to give attention to the work which has to be done in order to complete inventories and catalogs, to complete the documentation of your collections. Here, just a few examples. What has represented the loss, the total loss of inventories and catalogs during a different kind of situation, during war, during fire. Here we have the archives of Angevin in Naples in 1943 that were destroyed by the war. This means that actually it was not possible to recompose this collection. The National Library, University Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina, also destroyed by fire, but due to the context of war in Sarajevo in 1982, same. So everything got destroyed. So not only the collections, but also the documentation that was associated to it. And the case that I was just mentioning before, that the case of Rio de Janeiro, where it has been demonstrated that the loss of inventory, the loss of documentation is adding an additional layer of disaster because it is really impossible then to reestablish or recompose the collection. So I was mentioning that for the movable heritage, we can evacuate, we can move the object, we can develop an evacuation plan. And we don't have to forget when we prepare the evacuation plan, not only to consider how to evacuate and what to evacuate as far as the items is concerned, but we need also to include the inventory. The inventory, there might be also an evacuation plan for the inventory, being in paper or digital format. So eventually pictures, collections, which are part of a documentation linked with the different objects. So we have to think is like the metadata of the objects has to be considered like also to be saved, to be evacuated together with the objects. The plan, of course, has to be designed taking all those elements into account. It has to be tested. It has to be evaluated after a potential disasters, and all the lesson learned has to be, of course, used to modify and adapt and improve this evacuation plan. But when we have a lot of items in a museum, libraries, or archive, and being them exhibited or in storage areas, how can we decide? How can we know what we had to evacuate first. And actually, you need to identify priority. And this is a work that has to be done in advance, something which is part, as I said before, of the preparation of the prevention phase. So in an emergency, evacuation list should already be known by the museum staff or by the people who will be asked to intervene and to help the museum staff during the response. And you have to imagine, of course, that you have limited time. You don't have a lot of tool or equipment at disposal. You don't have perhaps enough hands and staff to intervene. So all these elements have to be really imagined through scenarios, because of course it will depend. You will act differently if it is an object evacuation plan in case of a flood, or in case of a fire, in case of a earthquake, etc., or a civil unrest, wars, etc. So for this reason, many scenarios have to be described, identified, discussed together with the team of the institutions. And for this different kind of situation, an object evacuation plan had to be defined. So, as you know, and as Pascal and Rohit already mentioned, disasters are all related, and very often are also consequence and origin of others disasters. So this is as also to be taken into consideration when you think about the evacuation of the object. And in order to define which object can be evacuated, you have to define a priority list of objects to be evacuated. And we have seen with experience in many occasions that, of course, there are many reasons why you decide that a certain object is priority compared to other objects. And we have values that has to be taken into account. And also at the same time, we have a physical logistical criteria for evacuation, which has to be taken into account. So putting together those in the reflection that the team has to have prior to the disaster situation, putting together those two, let's say, elements, the values and the logistic criteria, you will be able to find, to come out with a priority list for the evacuation. Because in many cases, objects are perhaps very important, very valuable, but they might be fixed to the wall, to the floor. Objects, sometimes they are less accessible, either because they are in a cupboard, because they are in shelves, in storage rooms. But sometimes they might be also too heavy, big size. And so even they are the most precious from the point of view of the value, economic value, they cannot really be moved. So for this, I propose a kind of, let's say, methodology to be used that you can try to use for numbers of items which has the same characteristics. For example, depending of your collections, depending of all typology of museums, if it is an archaeology museum, if it is a science museum, if it is a painting gallery. So try to, let's say, to find first common typology of objects, and then try to identify in a kind of table the different kind of value that might be associated to those typology of objects. So the values are not only economic, they are linked with insurance, of course, but they are not only economic, can be symbolic value, symbolic to the people, to the community, symbolic to the collection itself, symbolic to the city, etc. So the symbolic value, it's time to time also can differ. historic value.
Dr. Christina,
also-
sorry to interrupt, but we
Yes.
have 2 minutes left. So,
Oh,
please.
okay, I go quicker.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are the value that you have to take into account, but at the same time, you also have physical, logistical elements, which are very important, because you might have an object which is very valuable, but if it is locked in a showcase, or if it is in a store under a lot of other objects, etc., of course, you cannot easily evacuate. So I don't go into details because of lack of time, but you will have a PowerPoint presentation with all the, let's say, the elements to go deeper. So putting together the values and the criteria, you will be able then to come out with some kind of ideas of what are the objects that can be in the priority list of objects to be evacuated. So, of course, you have to create a salvage team, and this team has to be prepared in advance, know that they are what they have to do, how they have to move internally in the museum, how they can really, which are the different routes that they have to follow in case of evacuation, etc. You need to identify the temporary locations, storage locations, and it will also, of course, depend on the kind of threat and the potential disaster that might occur in your area. And of course, you have to be sure that you have already imagined through the scenario how those objects can be disassembled, routed internally and externally, transported, etc. So these will be all things and elements that will be part of an object evacuation plan. So sorry, I rushed a little bit at the end. And of course, this kind of subject needs to be developed a little bit further, but I am at disposal for questions, if any. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christina. You provided us with kind of a systematic approach of, let's say, how to deal with movable heritage. And also you mentioned that the evacuation plan, the process, even you go to details like numbering stuff, boxing, etc. So, I mean, in a way, this evacuation plan and should be prepared in advance. And you mentioned that the team should be well prepared. Even temporary locations should also be identified in advance. Otherwise, we cannot define all this stuff in the time of disaster. But I have one question when it comes to the evacuation plan. It seems easy process to follow, but I believe that through your experience, you have maybe like faced a lot of challenges during doing evacuation plan. So if you can just quickly mention kind of challenges you faced by your experience and how to deal with.
Yeah, there are a lot of it. It seems easy, but it is not, because as I said, for each kind of typology of object, you have characteristics which are different. And for each kind of disasters, you have also, let's say, behavior that will be different. So the fact that you have all those many different elements, you have to cross all of them and imagine for each type of typology of disaster, typology of collection, to see how to come out with a priority list of evacuation of objects is quite complex. That's why it is a work which has to be taken with time, with reflection, with different kind of professional, let's say, contribution to it, because this is guards and curators and technicians might have different kind of approach or suggestion to it, and then yes, it is depending also of the, let's say, how the staff is used to, let's say, to be in a context of disasters. As Rohit mentioned, the fact that climate change is now affecting more and more many countries, some more than others. Of course, the staff of the institutions is more and more, let's say, used to tackle and manage the situation of disasters. So I think that the experience, unfortunately, if I have to say this, the experience will also prepare them in a better way, because they will start really understanding what the priority are depending on the kind. I've seen this in Pakistan with the Lahore Museum in particular, but not only. This has been, let's say, the disaster itself has learned a lot of lessons on really and prepare better the staff to understand the importance of preparing evacuation plan. So unfortunately, as usual, unless something is not happening,
this is what we are looking for, to share experience that people can learn from others. And also preparedness is always the key, training as well. Even if we don't have or used to deal with, but training could minimize the impact of any risk. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really like, it has a nice flow and present how to deal with movable heritage in a very easy and nice way. Thank you so much. And let me move to our last but not least presenter. I will switch to Arabic. So if people who cannot understand Arabic, you can move through interpretation bottom to English language, so you can hear the translation. دكتور محمد، كيف الحال؟
أهلا دكتور، كيف حالكم؟
أهلا فيك.
شكرا جزيلا.
ختامها مسك زي ما بيحكوها، وإحنا يمكن الأكثر انغلب الطابع النظري على العروض الأخرى، لكن الآن العرض هذا مميز لأنه بيعرض حالة مميزة بصراحة. وأنا من فترة يعني حاب أطلع على تجربة المغرب، لأنها كانت تجربة مميزة بصراحة في التعامل المباشر سواء في المنهجية أو حتى في النتائج. فدكتور محمد، اسمح لي أعرف الحضور والخبراء المشاركين عليه. الدكتور محمد بو صالح، محافظ تراث أنثروبولوجي ومدير مركز ترميم وتوظيف التراث المعماري بالمناطق الأطلسية وما وراءها. نقطة الاتصال الوطنية للمملكة المغربية لاتفاقية اليونسكو لسنة 1972 لحماية التراث العالمي. محافظ قصر آية بن حدو، طبعا الموقع التراث العالمي المشهور. والدكتور محمد أستاذ زائر حاليا وسابقا في العديد من الكليات الجامعية في المملكة المغربية، وهو خبير طبعا في برنامج التراث العالمي حول الهندسة المعمارية الطينية Earthen Architecture. دكتور محمد، نتشرف فيك وأعطيك الوقت الكافي لعرض الحالة الدراسية. تفضل دكتور.
شكرا دكتور ويبو، كل الأصدقاء بالإيسيسكو، كما أشكر كذلك كل المتدخلين الذين سبقوني بعروضهم القيمة. وهذا في الحقيقة الموضوع الذي خصصتموه للتغييرات المناخية، للزلازل، للظواهر الطبيعية التي تؤثر على المعالم التراثية وعلى المواقع الأثرية، هو موضوع في الحقيقة موضوع الساعة، وموضوع تعاني منه كل الدول. أنا في الحقيقة منذ أكثر من 30 سنة وأنا أتابع هذا الموضوع فيما يتعلق خاصة بالتغييرات المناخية، لأنني أعيش في منطقة اللي هي منطقة الأحواض الشبه الصحراوية الكبرى أو منطقة الواحات المغربية الكبرى. كما أن علاقتي بقصر آيت بن حدو منذ سنوات، تقريبا منذ 30 سنة، مكنني من متابعة هذه الظواهر، خاصة فيما يتعلق بالفيضانات وبالعواصف المدمرة. ثم في سنة 2023 تتبعت هذه الظاهرة الجديدة بالنسبة لنا، بالنسبة للمنطقة اللي هي زلزال الذي ضرب منطقة الحوس. في الحقيقة كلها كما قلت، فإن هذا الزلازل ضرب معالم من المعالم الكبرى للمملكة المغربية، والتي تمثل معالم استثنائية معمارية ورموز للمملكة المغربية. وهذه بعض الصور التي تثبت في الحقيقة منذ سنوات أهمية هذا التراث المعماري المتواجد في هذه المناطق الشبه الصحراوية. هذه بعض اللوحات لرسام عالمي تعرفونها كلكم، اللي هو جاك ماجوريل. كلكم تعرفون حدائق جاك ماجوريل بمنطقة مراكش. هذا الرسام العالمي في الحقيقة عاش في عشرينيات القرن العشرين بمنطقة ورزازات وبمنطقة الأحواض شبه الصحراوية الكبرى، وترك لنا في الحقيقة لوحات عالمية اللي هي اليوم كذلك تعتبر مرجعا مهما في مجال إعادة الاعتبار للتراث المعماري، خاصة فيما يتعلق بالتدخلات في مجال الترميم، إضافة إلى كثير في الحقيقة من الصور ومن الرسومات ومن الرفوعات الهندسية التي في الحقيقة نتوفر عليها منذ تقريبا قرن من الزمن. كذلك الأهمية ديال هذا التراث المعماري يتجلى في كونه رمز من رموز المملكة المغربية، وهنا تشاهدون في الحقيقة هو متواجد على الطوابع الباريدية منذ الأربعينيات والخمسينيات من القرن العشرين، ثم كذلك فيما يتعلق بالأوراق النقدية. وقد شكل كذلك هذا التراث منذ سنوات مجالا للبحث في مجال السوسيولوجيا، في مجال الهندسة المعمارية، في مجال التراث، في مجال التهيئة العمرانية لعديد من الباحثين. وكذلك تم إحداث في الحقيقة نظريات مهمة ومتعددة انطلاقا من هذا التراث المهم. كانت هناك إشكالية عويصة في الأيام الأولى للزلزال، اللي هي ظاهرة طبيعية لم يتعود المسؤولون عليها من قبل، خاصة المسؤولون المحليون والمؤسسات المحلية، مما طرح صعوبة للتدخل. ولم يكن التراث عن معزل عن هذا الأمر، فقد أدى الزلزال إلى تدمير مئات من المنازل التقليدية في القرى الجبلية وإلى تصدعات في مباني تاريخية، فاهتزت معه ذاكرة ممتدة في الطين والحجر. تضررت القصور والقصبات والمخازن الجماعية بشكل متفاوت. وهذا التراث يشهد على عبقرية الإنسان في التشييد والتكيف مع الطبيعة. لقد شكل الزلزال لحظة اختبار حقيقية لصمود هذا التراث وفرصة إعادة التفكير في استراتيجيات الترميم والحفاظ على الذاكرة المعمارية الأطلسية والشبه الصحراوية. عندما ضرب الزلزال كنا نقوم باجتماعات في الحقيقة تدوم ليالي وأيام. في الحقيقة كنا نبدأ من 9 صباحا ولا تتم الاجتماعات إلا في 4 بعد صباحا، نظرا لأن في الحقيقة هذا التراث لم يكن من بين الأولويات، لأن عندما ضرب الزلزال كانت هناك أولويات إعادة الإسكان، في الحقيقة إعادة بناء المدارس، إعادة بناء المستوصفات، إباعنا كذلك المستشفيات إلى غير ذلك. إذن في الحقيقة عندما نتحدث عن التراث كانت هناك إشكالية في الحقيقة كبرى، حتى بالنسبة للساكنة، بالنسبة للمنازل كان الناس في الحقيقة يقولون اليوم يجب التفكير في الحقيقة في بناء منازل من الإسمنت المسلح. احنا لا نريد أن نبني بالطين أو نبني مثلا بالتراب أو نبني بالحجارة أو بالخشب، لأن دائما في فكر الإنسان بأن هذا الحديد والإسمنت المسلح هو مضاد للزلازل أكثر من المواد المحلية، وهذا خطأ كبير في الحقيقة. وقد وقفنا على هذا الخطأ، لأن البنايات الطينية إذا كانت تمت بشكل معقل وبشكل علمي وبشكل في الحقيقة صحيح فهي تعتبر مضادة للزلازل. وسأثبت لكم ذلك ببعض الصور في قصبة كبيرة التي أشتغل عليها والتي يتواجد بها المركز الذي أشتغل به. في الحقيقة لما ضرب الزلزال لم نحس احنا بقوة الزلزال في هذه البنايات الطينية، ولم يقع في الحقيقة أي تدمير فيما يتعلق الطبق الأول أو الطبق الثاني أو الطبق الثالث، اللهم بعض التشققات التي ظهرت في المناطق العليا، وسنأتي على ذكر ذلك وسنحاول أن نفسره. تلاحظون في الصور بأن في الحقيقة لا يوجد هناك.
نعم، ممكن تحرك السلايدات عشان نمشي معك
كويس.
للأسف ما لا تتحرك. طيب
كويس
الآن نعم كويس تمام.
إذن فتلاحظون بأن في الحقيقة ليست هناك بنايات، هناك في الحقيقة تلاحظون كثير من البنايات في الحقيقة التي تستجيب حتى للمعايير. هناك إسمنت، هناك حجر، هناك تراب، هناك خليط. إذن في الحقيقة كلها بنايات هجينة بدون زلزال يمكن أن تسقط، وهذا كما تلاحظون في كثير من البنايات التي ترونها أمامكم. كذلك كانت هناك إشكالية كبرى، هو أن الناس كانوا يتدخلون في الحقيقة بشكل كذلك عبثي وحتى بشكل كذلك هجين فيما يتعلق بعملية الترميم حتى قبل الزلزال. وهنا ترون بعض الصور التي تمثل هذه التدخلات التي لا تستجيب في الحقيقة للمعايير المحافظة على هذه المباني التاريخية، وهذه كلها متواجدة في المناطق التي ضربها الزلزال. وهنا تلاحظون بأن حتى كذلك التدخلات القبلية أثرت كذلك عندما ضرب الزلزال، أثرت على هذه المباني. دونك هذه هي الصور كلها للمواقع التي تتواجد بهذه المنطقة قبل الزلازل. هذو من المخازن الجماعية، مخازن الحبوب الجماعية الكبرى المتواجدة بهذه المناطق. هذه الصور تعبر عن هذا الحدث الذي وقع، هذا قبل الزلزال، هذه بعد الزلزال. ثم كذلك وقعنا في إشكالية كبرى، هو أن بعد إعادة الاعتبار لهذه المناطق في الحقيقة تم بناء منازل لا تستجيب في الحقيقة للثقافة، لا تستجيب كذلك للعادات والتقاليد المستعملة في هذه المناطق. بنينا في الحقيقة بسرعة لأن كان هناك تسرع، كان هناك في الحقيقة إشكالية كبرى لبناء تقريبا منازل في الحقيقة اللي هي كذلك ربما لا تستجيب للمعايير البنائية والمعايير الإنشائية التقليدية بهذه المناطق. إذن كذلك بأن قلنا كيف نتعامل مع هذا الحدث؟ قلنا بأننا سنقوم باختيار كل المواقع التي هي مدرجة على لائحة التراث الوطني أو على لائحة التراث العالمي، في الحقيقة لكي تكون هي مجال لتطبيق في الحقيقة التدخلات التقنية، وكذلك لكي تكون هي مثال لخصوصية العمارة الطينية والحجرية، وكذلك لتثبت بأن هذه الخصوصيات ليست مجرد تقنية بناء، بل هو نظام بيئي وثقافي مهم. هنا عندما ضرب الزلزال كما قالت الأستاذة التي تدخلت قبل مني، هو أننا من في الحقيقة كنا هذه السنوات 30 سنة ونحن نعمل على جرد كل التراث المعماري المتواجد في المناطق شبه الصحراوية وفي المناطق الجبلية. كما أننا اليوم في المملكة المغربية المركز يتوفر على قاعدة بيانات مهمة جدا في الحقيقة باستعمال الصور الجوية منذ العشرينيات من القرن العشرين حتى إلى 2025. وهنا كذلك توجد هذه القاعدة البيانات جميع البنايات في الحقيقة. ربما أقول لكم اليوم نتوفر على 4000 قرية، نتوفر على 800 في الحقيقة قصبة اللي هي مساكن الأعيان ومساكن الأسر التي ظهرت في القرن الثامن عشر، نتوفر على تقريبا 600 مخزن للحبوب الجماعي، كلها في الحقيقة معروفة بدقة. وهذا في الحقيقة مكن من التدخل بسرعة في هذه المجالات. ونوضح بعض الأمثلة لكل الأبواب التاريخية والمتواجدة بهذه المناطق، بالنسبة للنوافذ، بالنسبة للأبواب، بالنسبة للمقارع، بالنسبة للمفصلات الأبواب، بالنسبة للأنماط الزخرفية، بالنسبة للأشكال الهندسية، بالنسبة للإنشاءات في الحقيقة. وهذا كما نقول في الحقيقة هذه واحدة الراحة النفسية لأننا نحس بها في الحقيقة سعادتنا بشكل كبير نظرا للمعرفة. أولا 30 سنة الخبرة مع كل المشتغلين والتقنيين الذين يشتغلون معي، ولكن كذلك هنا في الحقيقة أقول لكم بأن إذا كانت هناك في الحقيقة جرد اللي هو علمي، جرد اللي هو تقني، فإن الحلول لا تستعصي في الحقيقة من أجل التدخل فيما يتعلق بالترميم. هذه بعض ستلاحظون هذه التدخلات، لأن بعض البلدان هذه قصبات وارتزات من أكبر القصبات القيادية في المغرب. هذه صورناها في سنة، ولكن اليوم قطعنا أشواط كبيرة في إعادة الترميم. هي من أكبر القصبات القيادية في المغرب، وكذلك تراث وطني منذ سنة 1954، ومن بين المعالم الكبرى للمملكة المغربية، وتتواجد في التجمع الحضاري لمدينة ورجازات، وهي اليوم مثال حي لتراث في الحقيقة مرمم بشكل علمي بشكل عقلاني، وكذلك تحويله إلى أهداف اقتصادية خاصة فيما يتعلق بالسياحة وفيما يتعلق كذلك بالتدخلات في مجال كذلك استغلال في المجال الإداري، في المجال كذلك الخزانات الوسائطية إلى غيرها من التوظيفات المهمة في هذا الإطار. وهي بالنسبة للمستوى الأول مساحة فهي تقريبا 20,000 متر مربع، مما يبين لكم في الحقيقة أهمية. وهذه كلها تلاحظون البداية تدخلات كل هذا اليوم في الحقيقة تمنا. تلاحظون كذلك استعمال كل التقنيات اللي هي التقليدية المستعملة في مجال إعادة الاعتبار للبنايات الطينية بالمنطقة. هذا في الحقيقة كنا اشتغلنا عليه كثير، لأن هذا التجمع هذه قرية أو قصر، ولكن كانت هناك إشكالية اللي هي مجتمعية فيما يخص الوضعية العقارية، فيما يخص كذلك السكن. ولكن إلى يوم هذا لازلنا نشتغل في الحقيقة في هذا الإطار للاستجابة للضروريات الملحة للسكنة. ثم هناك بعض كذلك هنا تلاحظون كذلك من أهم القصبات هي كذلك تراث وطني منذ سنة 2018. وكل ما تلاحظونه هي بداية الأشغال، وهي من أجمل القصبات المتواجدة في المغرب، وهي كذلك متواجدة على الأوراق النقدية من فئة 50 درهم، وقوتها تتجلى في الزخارف، من أجمل القصبات المغربية فيما يتعلق بالزخارف، وهي على بعد 30 كيلومتر من مدينة ورجازات. كذلك تلاحظون في بداية الأشغال، وكذلك هذا العمل هذا تم تثمينه وتتمته في ظرف تقريبا 5 أشهر. وقد تطلب بالنسبة لقصبة التوريث التي رأيتموها خصصنا لها تقريبا 4 ملايين أورو. هذه تقريبا تطلبت منا 1,000,000 درهم 100,000 يورو. وكنتم تلاحظون كذلك كل هذه التدخلات اليوم فيما يتعلق بهذه الأمثلة. ثم عندنا التدخل الثالث اللي هو قصر أيت بن حدو. كلكم تعرفون بأن هذا أيقونة المعمار على الصعيد العالمي والإنساني. هذا مدرج على لائحة التراث ديال منظمة اليونسكو منذ سنة 1987، وهو درس في المعمار وملخص معماري نجد فيه جميع البنايات التي لا نجدها في مناطق أخرى من المغرب. نجد مخزن جماعي، نجد هذه القلعة، نجد بنايات سكنية، نجد كذلك قصبات. في الحقيقة هو كل المنازل التي قمنا بترميمها سابقا كما تلاحظون هنا في الصورة هي لم تتأثر بالزلزال. كل ما تأثر بالزلزال هي البنايات التي كانت في حالة متدهورة فيما قبل، كمثلا هذا بقايا المخزن الجماعي المتواجد على لائحة التلة، وبعض المناطق هنا المتعلقة بالقصبات، وبعض الأمكنة التي كانت فيما قبل مهجورة. ثم عندنا التدخل الرابع في هذا الإطار هي بعض القصبة التي تم إخلاؤها منذ استقلال المغرب منذ سنة 1956، وهي كذلك مدرجة على لائحة التراث الوطني منذ 1954. وهي بالنسبة للتدخلات وإعادة التأهيل، الدروس أولا المستخلصة. هناك التوثيق قبل التدخل الميداني. كان هناك وضع برنامج متكامل للتدخل، حصر مبالغ الترميم، التدخلات التقنية الأولية، تدعيم المباني. النقطة كذلك المهمة اللي هي إعادة استعمال المواد المحلية. تدريب، وهذه النقطة من الإشكاليات التي كنا نعاني منها، هو غياب الحرفيين، وقمنا كذلك بتدريب الحرفيين المحليين على تقنية البناء، وكذلك التدخل فيما يتعلق بالمخاطر سواء بالنسبة للفيضانات وكذلك بالنسبة للزلازل. ثم النقطة الأخرى التي اشتغلنا عليها كثيرا هي إدماج المجتمع المحلي في مشاريع الصيانة وخاصة بقصر أيس بن حدو. بالنسبة للتحديات المطروحة التي بينتها في الحقيقة هذه التجربة هي قلة اليد العاملة في المجال، هذه من الإشكاليات الكبرى. النقطة الثانية هي غياب الكفاءات المتخصصة في الحقيقة، لأننا نشتغل على هذا المجال اليوم مهندسين الذين يشتغلون في هذا المجال.
So Dr. Mohammed Bousaleh, he was mentioning the case of earthquake happened in 2023. Let me just quickly go through the lessons he mentioned, and he want to highlight through his experience that we have to do documentation. Documentation is a key for recovery process. Also, temporary, let's say, stabilization for structures is important, especially for historic cities, which has many attributes and building. When we recover, we should be careful when we use the material. We should use the local, and the material has been used before. The training is a key for recovery process. Without training, we're gonna fail. We don't have employee, and also we need to traditional technicians in our missions. دكتور محمد، نعتذر على الخلل الفني اللي صار من طرفنا، لكن نوعدك انه نعوضها بشيء خاص التجربة المغربية. شكرا جزيلا لك. And I would like to thank all distinguished speakers, all attendees for joining our webinar, and also Dr. Ndoro for open and Dr. Lazar to open this. This is our first webinar, and a lot of webinars are coming this year and also the next year. We will keep you updated, and thank you so much for participating. This webinar is recorded. It's gonna be edited and also gonna be uploaded on YouTube, so you can share it with everyone who is interested to know more information about disaster risk management. And have a nice Friday for everyone. Thank you.
Shukran. Thank you.
Thank you. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you so much for everyone. Thank you.
شكرا.